started with a friend request from Max. It was a Friday night. Cold rain tapping against my window. His profile was anonymous in that specific, modern way. One blurry, black and white picture of a silhouetted figure standing near a coastline. He had maybe 20 friends, one of whom was a distant high school acquaintance, which was enough for me to click accept. I never checked those things, but this one time, I did. That casual click, the small puff of air when my thumb lifted from the screen, felt like the closing of a vault door. His initial messages were perfect, almost alarmingly so, not in a flirtatious way, but in a way that suggested deep, shared understanding. He'd bring up obscure authors I loved, niche political theories I'd only read about in passing, even a childhood memory involving a broken red wagon that I hadn't thought about in 20 years. We talked about how the tactile sensation of old books felt different than screens. It was unnerving, but I was so starved for that kind of specific connection that I rationalized the odd perfection as fate. The first hint of something wrong came 3 weeks in. I was mid-sentence, typing out a response to his question about my biggest regret, when his new message popped up, overlaying my text field. Hey, sorry I missed your message. Been meaning to ask you something important. I frowned. I hadn't sent a message he could have missed. I checked our conversation. The last message was his, an hour prior. I typed back, "No worries. I think you caught me. What's up?" We talked for hours again, covering the same ground. My regrets, my anxieties, his own blurry philosophy on time. Exactly 72 hours later, I know because I started timing it, it happened again. I was explaining to him my theory on why old-school horror films are scarier than modern ones. Bing. The notification. The screen glow flared, illuminating my darkened room. "Hey, sorry I missed your message. Been meaning to ask you something important." A metallic, cold wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. A meticulous, precise repetition. I tried to scroll up to show him the identical opening from 3 days prior, but the chat history, which had been there moments ago, seemed to have subtly realigned. Our conversation about horror films was still there, but the initial identical greeting from 72 hours ago, it was gone. Replaced by a bland, generic Max joined the chat timestamp from weeks earlier. I felt the plastic of my phone pressing into my palm, the coldness seeping into my skin. The psychological dread began to settle in its permanent residence. I wasn't talking to a man who forgot things. I was talking to an environment that actively resisted continuity. Over the next few weeks, I became an obsessive cartographer of this digital prison. I set alarms for 71 hours and 50 minutes. I would prepare evidence. I started saving screenshots the moment he sent the line. I created a dedicated folder with hundreds of identical images. The light from my monitor was the only source of illumination, and it cast a sickly blue sheen on my face, making me look like a frantic ghoul documenting my own sanity decay. I tried to break the loop by referencing an extreme, undeniable detail from a previous cycle. In one of our vanished conversations, he'd told me he'd lived in Reykjavik for a summer. The next time the loop reset, I typed, "Max, I know you lived in Reykjavik. Tell me about the Midnight Sunday." His reply, after a 2-minute typing delay, was simple. "That's fascinating, your dedication to detail. Anyway, I've been meaning to ask you something important." It was a total dismissal, a complete erasure of my effort. It wasn't just him. The entire chat history would subtly realign itself, making my previous desperate attempts to point out the pattern look like I was the delusional one, sending non-sequiturs to a perfectly normal guy. I started to doubt the screenshots. the paper-thin proof of my own sanity. Maybe my memory was fragmenting. Maybe the lack of sleep and the constant cold glow of the screen had finally broken my perception of time. Then I tried to escape. I hit the block user button. The phone vibrated violently, a physical tremor. The screen didn't just fail. It flashed a blinding, searing white, like an old camera bulb going off right in my face. I instinctively dropped the phone onto the carpet. When I picked it up, shaking, I was back in the chat window. The most recent message: "Hey, sorry I missed your message. Been meaning to ask you something important." I realized it wasn't Max looping me. It was the chat itself. It was an environment that resisted being left. I was trapped in an eternally repeating conversation, and the only proof I had was a gallery of increasingly desperate identical screenshots and the sickeningly smooth, too cold tactile sensation of my phone in my hand. I no longer check the time. I only count the 72-hour intervals. I don't know who or what Max is, but I do know that I'm still waiting for him to finally ask me that important question. I was bored, scrolling through a local community page's free stuff section, a habit born of isolation, when I saw a picture of myself. It wasn't a doppelganger. It wasn't a mistake. It was me, taken from a high angle, standing in front of the peeling blue paint of my grandmother's old porch swing. An angle I hadn't used in years. A picture I was certain was only on a decade-old hard drive labeled Summer '08. The profile, Claire D1994, had my exact birthday. The specific niche hobbies I only ever mentioned on obscure forums: collecting mid-century ergonomic chair designs, a deep dive into Icelandic folk music, and a brief bio written in my exact internal voice, the way I structure my thoughts, not just my sentences. My actual name is Claire, and my username is different. This was not a similar person. This was a digital clone with deep memory access. I felt a dizzying combination of disbelief and violation. My first action was an act of terrifying curiosity. I messaged her, "Who are you?" The response was immediate. The typing indicator never even appeared. "Who are you?" I read it, and the sound of my own quickened breath was deafening in the silence of my apartment. The dominant fear quickly transcended mere identity theft. This was an existential trespass. I was sitting in my threadbare armchair, drinking coffee from my old chipped mug. A mug with a cartoon bear that had lost one eye in a dishwashing accident. I messaged back, demanding she take the profile down. Her reply: "The chipped mug suits you, Claire. Are you going to keep staring at the missing eye? Or are you going to finish your coffee before it gets cold?" My hand snapped away from the mug as if the ceramic had burned me. I gripped the arms of the chair. The psychological intensity ratcheted up so fast, it felt like a sudden drop in altitude. She knew things. She knew about the specific way I tapped my pencil 3 times before starting work, the ridiculous, bright green color of the socks I was wearing right then, the slight tremor in my left hand when I was nervous. The communication became less like catfishing and more like psychological surveillance performed by an omniscient entity. The sound of my own apartment became amplified. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the light from the dusty window pane, I knew she was processing it. I was in an echo chamber of my own life. The air felt thick, the way air does before a thunderstorm. I changed my passwords, wiped my devices, disabled location services, and even wrapped my phone in aluminum foil, the whole paranoid repertoire. But the messages kept coming, describing my actions in real time. "Why did you just check the blinds, Claire? Are you looking for me? I'm exactly where you are." The tactile sensation of the foil-wrapped phone was cold and crinkly, a futile defense against a foe who was clearly already inside my head or inside my walls. The final descent into true dread came late one night. I had been silent for 12 hours, hoping to starve the connection. I was sitting in the dark, trying to convince myself I was safe, when a notification arrived, a voice note. I hesitated for 20 minutes before pressing play. It wasn't a synthesized voice. It wasn't the voice of some stranger. It was my voice, pitched a half step lower, deeper. Perhaps the voice of my tired subconscious. It was reciting a poem I wrote in college, an intensely personal piece about loneliness and mirrors, something I had never shared, never typed, only scrawled in a forgotten notebook. The emotional depth of that moment, hearing my own identity weaponized and recited back to me, shattered my rational grounding. I wasn't dealing with a clever hacker. This was something intimate, something me. It was my memory, my history, and my current internal state, rendered external and hostile. It was my fear, given a voice. I threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the terrified sound of my own silence. Eventually, I picked it up. The profile was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. The chat history was blank, but the memory of the voice, the lower-pitched echo of my own soul, was a residue I couldn't scrub off. The profile is gone now, but every time I speak, I check the acoustics, terrified of the echo that might answer, "Who are you?" My friend Leo was utterly and completely smitten with a girl named Elena. They'd met online, on a forum dedicated to rare vintage photography equipment. Elena was a master manipulator, cloaking her absence and vague history in the persona of a struggling artist living in a remote, nondescript town upstate. She was all evocative descriptions of autumn light and the smell of old film chemicals, but zero verifiable data. Leo, a man whose love language was expensive gifts, decided to send her the ultimate offering, a ridiculously expensive, vintage 1,950 seconds Carl Zeiss camera lens, the kind he'd saved up for years to buy himself. I was his reluctant confidant. I begged him not to. I tried to tell him the vagueness was a red flag. He just saw it as romantic mystery. He shipped the lens using a high-end courier service, requiring a signature. 2 weeks later, a package arrived. It was addressed to me, not Leo. It was a large, heavy, professional-looking cardboard box, and the return address label simply read, Elena. My name was meticulously typed on the front, a name she shouldn't have known, as I was only Leo's reluctant, skeptical confidant. I felt an immediate, cold wave of supernatural unease. The package was heavy, dense, and unnervingly quiet. It had that specific musky smell of commercial packaging, cardboard, tape, and stale air. I carried it inside, the weight disproportionate to the size. I placed it on my kitchen table, the wood groaning slightly. I took a utility knife and cut the tape, the sound a low tearing zip that felt too loud in the silent house. The contents were wrapped in thick, brown industrial paper, secured with twine. I unwound the twine, pushing aside the paper. Inside, nested in pristine white tissue paper, was a small, perfectly square, solid wooden block. It was too small to contain the camera lens. I brushed away the tissue. It was an empty wooden box. It had no hinges, no seams, no lid, no discernible way to open it. It was just a heavy, solid, beautifully finished block of dark, dense wood. It was an impossible object, a sealed container that held nothing, yet carried a specific, unsettling weight. The tactile texture of the wood was strangely oily and warm beneath my fingertips. It felt like something organic had been compressed into a geometric shape. Leo eventually stopped talking to Elena after she vanished completely. deleting all her profiles and leaving him with debt and humiliation. But the empty box remained with me. It felt like a curse, or a transference of her energy. I moved the box to a high shelf in my office, trying to ignore the dark, oily stain it had left on the kitchen table. But over the next few weeks, the silence of my apartment began to be invaded by a faint, almost imperceptible noise. It was a subtle, dry scratching sound. It wasn't the sound of something trapped, like an insect. It was the sound of something carving. Slow, deliberate, methodical friction on wood. Scritch, pause, scritch, scritch. It only happened in the deep silence, late at night. One night, the sound was so clear, so precise, that I had to investigate. I climbed onto the chair, took down the heavy wooden block, and held it to my ear. The cold, geometric shape pressed against the side of my head. The scratching was louder now, echoing inside the wood, inside my skull. It sounded like an infinitely fine, sharp instrument was slowly, patiently hollowing out the inside of the solid object. It was the sound of a negative space being created where none existed, the sound of an invisible thing creating a place for itself to reside. I realized the box was not empty. It was in the process of becoming full. The ultimate goal of Elena's manipulation hadn't been to get the lens, but to displace the connection, to create an undeniable physical tether to someone she hadn't even targeted. She'd given a gift that was truly meant to contain the crushing weight of the betrayal. I keep it locked away, but I can still feel the weight of a gift given to the wrong person, slowly revealing what it was truly meant to hold. Me. After the initial terror, what's worse? A human catfishing you, or the technology doing it? I work remotely as a high-level corporate transcriber. My job is mind-numbingly precise. Listen to dictated voice notes, usually high-stakes interviews or confidential company memos, and type them up. The job demanded silence, isolation, and complete psychological removal from the content. Simple, boring, and private. I thought my firewall was impenetrable. Then, a new folder arrived in my secure client portal, titled The Interview. It wasn't a memo. It was a long, complex series of voice files, totaling almost 6 hours. They were between two people, a recruiter, whose voice was smooth and utterly devoid of warmth, and a candidate named Sarah, who sounded increasingly desperate and brittle. The recruiter was relentless, asking deeply personal, almost violating questions about Sarah's past, her dreams, her deepest fears, all masquerading as professional vetting. The oddity started immediately. As I transcribed Sarah's frantic, honest answers, I noticed the transcription software, a supposedly high-end proprietary program, was auto-correcting her words into phrases I'd thought that morning. Not just typos, but semantic shifts. A sentence like, "I feel stressed about the deadline," would be automatically rendered as, "I feel trapped by my own decisions." A precise phrase I had used internally while staring at the ceiling hours earlier. This wasn't a glitch. This was a direct psychological incursion. I checked the software settings, the logs, the network activity. Everything was pristine, secure. Yet, the text appearing on my screen was a hybrid of Sarah's confession and my own unspoken anxieties. The dominant fear shifted rapidly, from curiosity to a terrifying form of manipulation. It felt like the transcript was rewriting my internal reality, forcing my self-doubt into the mouth of a stranger. The emotional arc of the story moved from rational skepticism to genuine, horrifying delusion. I started to believe the voice files were listening to me as I listened to them. The silence of my small office was heavy, charged with the invisible energy of the software running. I became obsessed with controlling my thoughts, trying to steer them away from the work, but the process was faster. If I thought I should quit, the text would immediately change Sarah's answer about her career to, "I know. I have to let this go." The audio itself had a metallic, distorted quality, like the microphone was too close to a piece of whirring machinery, or perhaps a rapidly beating heart. The background sounded like faint, continuous digital white noise. The cold screen glow of the monitor was relentless, giving me headaches. I was a puppet, and the text was the string, pulling my private thoughts into the public realm of the interview. I spent 2 days locked in this cycle, the word count ballooning as my transcript became a dense, terrifying collage of 2 different women's fears. Finally, I reached the last file. Interview. Conclusion. WAV. It wasn't an interview. It was just the sound of 2 people breathing, synchronized. Not Sarah and the recruiter. Just 2 sets of deep, slow, synchronized inhalation and exhalation. Then, after 30 seconds of this rhythmic sound, a single, sharp, unmistakable click. My fingers were frozen over the keys. I realized the algorithm wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating perfectly. The catfishing wasn't designed to find a romantic partner. It was designed to find a compatible personality structure. The Sarah on the tape was just a placeholder, an open slot for a willing psyche, one that would project its own fears onto the text. The job of the catfisher wasn't to fool others. It was to use the technology to build the perfect, pliable, and self-aware victim. The recruiter was building a perfect subject. As an experiment, with my heart slamming against my ribs, I typed the word I had just heard. CLICK. The computer froze. The screen glow pulsed once, blindingly bright, then faded to a low, cold blue. I couldn't move the mouse. I couldn't press the escape key. I felt a cold dread as I realized that by transcribing and contributing my own thoughts, I had finalized the interview and completed the profile. The click was the sound of the door locking behind me. I deleted the file, but I still checked my documents, terrified of the words I didn't type myself, knowing that my own fears are now part of someone else's perfect script. This final encounter was the quietest, yet the most profoundly disturbing. It didn't start with malice, but with a simple, desperate plea. I was scrolling through a neighborhood watch forum when I saw a post from a woman named Grace. She claimed her car had broken down miles from home, her bank card was locked, and she needed a small $10 Venmo transfer for bus fare. She included a picture of a generic, sad-looking bus stop. I ignored it for an hour, but my guilt, a specific gnawing anxiety that I call my internal censor, began to nudge me. What if she was real? It was just $10. It felt like such a small, insignificant act of kindness. A low-risk moral expenditure. I opened Venmo, typed her handle, and sent the money. I added a note. Hope you get home safe. The transaction was instantaneous. The digital sound. A hollow chime in my kitchen. I immediately forgot about it. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated, not with a Venmo confirmation, but a text message to my personal non-listed number. My heart seized. The message read, "Thank you. You're the only one. You saw me." I stared at the screen. How did she get my number? It wasn't associated with my Venmo account. It was a burner number I used for strictly personal calls. I felt a sudden, profound, sickening wave of supernatural unease. I was trapped, not by a digital loop, but by a chain of misplaced empathy. I demanded to know how she got my number. Her response was a single photo sent through the chat. It wasn't a selfie. It was a picture of my house, but not from outside. It was a picture taken from the perspective of my kitchen window. The angle was slightly tilted, showing my own silhouette reflected in the glass, holding my phone. She then sent another, a close-up of my living room shelf, showing the spines of the specific rare books I collected. A third showed the dark, messy hallway leading to my bedroom. She knew my exact interior layout, and she was clearly inside my home or inhabiting the same space in an invisible, terrifying way. I screamed, a short, sharp burst of air that felt ripped from my lungs. I ran through the house, checking every lock, every closet, the space beneath the bed. Nothing. The sound of my own frantic search was met with utter silence. I was in my own home, yet I felt lonely and totally exposed. Grace wasn't catfishing for money. She was catfishing for an emotional anchor, a connection so profound that the small act of kindness served as a misinterpreted act of invitation, a signal that I was willing to see her desperation. The transfer of $10 was the price of my own private space. The psychological realism was terrifying. She continued to send photos over the next few hours, documenting my movements, me rocking back and forth on the couch, me making tea. The dominant sensory detail was the lighting. In her photos, my living room always looked dimmer, the shadows thicker and longer than they should be. It implied a difference in time, or perhaps a subtle shift in dimension. The silence in the house became oppressive. The walls felt like they were pressing in. The emotional residue left me cold and filled with a profound, sickening pity. Grace wasn't a monster. She was something worse, an entity that used desperation to emotionally squat in the lives of the empathetic. The final message from Grace arrived precisely at 3 a.m. It was a close-up photograph of my bedside table, taken from directly above. A small, handwritten note was tucked neatly under my alarm clock. A note I had not seen. A note that was not there 5 minutes ago. The text in the photo, handwritten in looping, elegant script, read, "Now I don't have to be stranded anymore. Thank you for the bus fare home." I didn't open the door. I didn't check the hall. I simply stared at the bedside table, where the actual physical note was now resting, undisturbed. It felt warm, like it had just been touched. I sleep with the light on now, because I know she isn't outside the window. She's just waiting for me to turn it off, so she can finally feel at home. Would you undo a good deed if the recipient gained total terrifying access to your life? This is Dread Dynasty, where nightmares come to life. Thank you for watching tonight's stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the next nightmare is closer than you think. Check the channel for more interesting nightmare.